Thank you. Welcome back, everybody, to our second afternoon panel. This one is on selecting for sustainability. And I feel like we had a really good introduction and segue into this one because a lot of the questions and comments in the last Q&A session really were trending toward a discussion about selection. How do you determine what is covered by the program? And that's really where I want to start, is with a definition of what we mean by selecting. In the context of shared print programs, we mean, how do you identify the materials that are covered by the program, the volumes, the content, the items that are covered by a retention period and made available to partners in the program? And there are a number of questions that pretty routinely come up in the planning phases of all the shared print programs I've seen that relate to selection. And we started identifying some of them even in the comments just in the session before. Some of them are things like, how do the program's goals and priorities affect what is selected for the program? Is it mostly about preservation, or is it mostly about space reclamation? Is it both? What are the relative weights of those things? Also, how are the individual materials identified? What process do you use to say, given this basic goal that we have for the program, then how do we get from this overarching goal to identifying very specific things to be kept, and who keeps them? Is it a process of saying, let's keep the things that match this digital resource over here? Or is it more a more interactive collection analysis of the participants' collections that may reveal some of these things, like the rareness that is common and the core that is ubiquitous? Another question that tends to come up is, to what extent is the selection of materials affected by the participants, by the specific participants in the program? To what extent do those individual institutions have priorities and holdings that drive the determination of what's covered by the program at all? And lastly, but not least, do selections made by other regional and national efforts affect the program choices for this program, and how do we know what they are, and how do we integrate other people's selections into our program? To what extent do we pay attention to that, or do we choose not to? So our three panelists today represent three different shared print programs that are in varying stages of planning and/or implementation. And we've asked them to talk today about their programs with paying particular attention to the selection activity and focus. So I'm going to, even though they're identified in the program, I'm going to give you just a 1 or 2 sentence introduction for each of them again. Jacob Nadal is the new executive director of the RECAP Consortium, founded by and for Columbia, Princeton, and the New York Public Library. RECAP has recently issued a planning report that outlines their thoughts about changing the shared RECAP library storage facility into a more truly shared RECAP collection, and Jake will talk about some of that. Clem Guthrow is Director of Libraries at Colby College in Waterville, Maine. Equally important, more important for this gathering, he is a prime mover in the Maine Shared Collection Strategy Project, which is a multi-type collaboration of libraries in the state of Maine, including some public libraries. That's an IMLS grant-funded project. And Pamela Grudgeon is head of technical services at Central Michigan, and she's been an active participant in the planning and operation of the Michigan Shared Print Initiative, which we fondly call MI-SPI. And she'll be talking about where MI-SPI is at this point. So let's start off with Jake.
Thanks, Lizanna. Hello, everyone. My name is Jacob Nadal. I'm Executive Director of RECAP, the Research Collections and Preservation Consortium. And today I'm going to talk briefly about the development of RECAP with an eye to giving you a case study in how preservation repositories develop over time, and especially as they adapt their operations to kind of prevailing needs of their partners. As I do this, I'm conscious of standing on some pretty substantial shoulders. A great deal of credit is due to Eileen Henthorne, my predecessor, RECAP's founding executive director. and to the partners themselves who have contributed a tremendous amount of work. And I'd like to acknowledge my board members who really saw through the project I'll talk about in a moment. Jim Neal, Stephen Rittenberg, Karen Trainer, Paul LaMarche, Ann Thornton, and Jeffrey Roth. Regarding our discussion of sort of how do you tell that a commitment has been made and how do we rise above our institutional levels, I think in some ways you tell it by partnerships and projects like this. RECAP was founded at the turn of the century by 3 partner libraries, Columbia University, Princeton University, and the New York Public Library. And at the time, these libraries were largely facing a problem of storage space, and as an adjunct to that, needed to improve the preservation environment for their collections and reduce the service costs associated, especially with lesser used materials. At present, RECAP holds over 11 million items. That's individual monographs and films, as well as massive amounts of serial publications and an ever-growing number of archival containers. Each month, we circulate about 15,000 items, about 1 to 2% of our total holdings in any given year, and we add around 50 to 60,000 items to the facility. To put all this in terms that are maybe native to OCLC and Dublin, Ohio, RECAP is both the shadow side and I think in some ways an expression of Lorcan Dempsey's observation about libraries and the information economy. It solves the question about scarcity of resources by bringing lots of stuff together in one place. And it's beginning to address the question about scarcity of attention by trying to make those materials available to more and more scholars to bring more attention to them so that they can get more use. When we put all those things together in one place, it's a lot easier to find and get them, and the per item costs of keeping them can be highly optimized. One of the issues we face when we talk about these regional collaborations and large-scale storage initiatives, however, is that very low per item costs can still create major capital costs. The RECAP modules are built on a massive scale. These are our newest modules, 8 and 9, and building on that scale forces certain issues, sharing the fixed costs of that up front, fairly allocating those costs for partner-specific needs, and planning for a return on that investment over an extended period of time. In fact, return on investment over an extended period of time is pretty close to my own working definition of preservation, which is sustainable activities optimized over time that maintain or improve the usability of resources. And in this context, I think extended can really have some meaning, something like more than 2 strategic planning cycles or beyond the legal mandate for financial records. And I say that to point out that it's important that we get from statements of principle to statements of practical force. When we talk about strategic planning cycles or legal retention, we're really talking about 10 years or so. And I think with that in mind, it's instructive to think of RECAP as just entering its second extended phase of development. At present, RECAP is effectively 3 collections that share a building and are supported by shared services, thankfully with no major capital projects on deck till about 2020. But the partners still have independent processes and policies for selection, for acquisition, for circulation, and for management of their collections. I'm sure that some of you know this model, Kinefin, a habituation model that was developed by Dave Snowden and Cynthia Kurtz, a framework for thinking about organizational development. It's especially useful, I think, in places like RECAP and in large processes like we're talking about today that deal with something that's a big mission or value statement, a capital P preservation, but has to realize itself in very specific, tangible operations. Early on, RECAP had to go from being a bright idea to a fully functioning building, and it had to bring a known process, the Harvard depository model, to life with a new staff and in a new location. As time went on, that process matured and it worked very well. Lots of collections were there, usage began to climb. But RECAP also began to transform from a low-use collection warehouse and a sort of last resort repository to, in fact, the largest single-site accumulation of materials within each partner's operations. And that called on us to start developing new service areas. The first of those to develop were interlibrary loan and electronic document delivery. I actually have a little place in the building I call Embassy Row, where we have terminals for New York Public, Columbia, and Princeton so that we can be their ILL staff for a moment each day. But those can be understood actually as part of a larger progression towards shared collections and expanded service options for that collection that we share. And the rest of this talk is going to explore those developments. I also want to remind you, though, that this is progressive work. Our topic today is selecting for sustainability in the context of right scaling of solutions. One of those things that's implicit in that is that we continue to refine our operations and activities over time. The discovery to delivery report I'm going to discuss next provides a framework in which we do that. So just as it took ReCap about 10 years to reach the point of exploring new directions, I think it's taken me just under 10 minutes to get to this point in the talk. That's a deliberate rhetorical ploy, right? What I'm going to talk to you about next is work that we do expect to see come to fruition, but this will happen over a year or two, not a month or two. With support from the Andrew Mellon Foundation, we explored a set of questions and developed a set of recommendations and ideas that have been published on our website, and you'll get that URL at the end of these slides. And the project identified 3 major thematic areas for our next stage of development. One is shared collections among the partners, making those collections available to each partner more quickly. Cooperative collection development, and really solidifying our long-term preservation commitments. And along with that, developing the tools and software we need to put that into practice. ReCap holds 11 million items, and the distribution is actually fairly equitable. The New York public has the largest storage space, Columbia slightly less, Princeton least of all, but Princeton actually adds more items more consistently in any given year than the others, enough that no one is sort of the big or small partner. There's a very equal contribution from all. That helps get this process going. Approximately 10% of what we have are duplicates and about 1% are triplicates. And when you factor that out, by sharing the collection in common, it means that each partner stands to gain access to 3 or 4 million new items for their users. So there's substantial incentive to make this work. There are also some substantial obstacles. There are no common ILS systems amongst the partners, of course. They also have managed to not share a single resource sharing network. They have, of course, different circulation policies, and they have different patron groups they serve. We have 2 very distinctive university groups within the consortium, as well as the nation's largest public research library. And so what the report has done is to try to overcome these barriers with some policy decisions and then to find the technology to support that. And on the policy side, we're beginning to frame our existing and prospective holdings in 3 ways. One is as the shared collection, which is available to all partners, subject to a retention commitment and some common agreements, but it's material that's available to their users just as anything else that library owns at present. The second group are what we call the open collections, as in open to. So these are materials that are available to all partners, not subject to a retention commitment or to other shared collection policies. So the owner can still back those materials out or change their mind about how they're used. And then the third group is restricted. This is essentially a proxy for special collections material, available primarily to or only through the permission of the owning library. The new accessions to ReCap will be shared by default as this project goes live, so that open or restricted status has to be specifically set. That is, we want to incentivize building this shared collection, building this resource. Alongside that change in policy, there has to be technology to facilitate the sharing. One solution would be to dump a few million records into everyone's ILS, but you take a moment to contemplate that, maybe a moment to revive any catalogers who are sitting next to you, and you can see why we needed to look for something else. So we're gravitating towards a piece of middleware that harvests bibliographic data from the partners' ILSs, shares it in their discovery environments, and then on the fly creates any ILS records and transactions needed to facilitate sharing. We have an extensive report that details this, but I'll just give you a quick glance at some of it. We discuss a presentation layer, something that makes the shared collection visible to users and library staff, a data services layer that does the job of integrating source data from the various ILSs and ReCap's own inventory systems, and a data layer that helps manage searching and discoverability across that data. We can also look at that as a more functional diagram, right? Something that describes to you the actual servers that are in production, ReCap's library archival system, the ILS systems that exist at each partner, the new web servers that have to be commissioned, the load balancing, and the various views and portals of that material, all detailed in the report that you can get from our site. The goal of all of this, what this all means, is that we move from a batch data, ILL-based world to real-time data availability and sharing. That enables us to do a lot of things. So right now, we do work when the batch of data arrives. In a real-time data environment, as data accumulates, we can be queued to begin certain types of work. It's very much like what you would discuss in a lean manufacturing environment or a sort of Toyota production system. It also lets us do some better analysis of fulfillment schedules. Right now, as I'm sure most of you have the experience, orders by a certain point in the day get fulfilled the next day, and orders just a minute after that point in time get fulfilled 2 to 3 days later. And one thing that we hope to examine as we have better real-time data is optimizing actually our work and shift schedule so that we pull materials as the critical mass of orders arrives so that there's always next day delivery for our partner libraries, something that's difficult to do in a batch data environment. That system also means cooperative collection development. Right now, there are plenty of handshake agreements that make this happen. Selectors try not to duplicate one another, but there's no good tool to search across. And as we were talking in the first panel, I kept sort of recalling the phrase that the plural of anecdote is not data. There are, in fact, many places where smart collection managers know what they've got and what someone else has, and they can avoid stepping on one another's toes. There are a lot more areas where we just don't, and the data have to carry the day. And this system is intended to bridge that gap for us. Finally, I want to say a little bit about retention commitment, which is not as technological a solution, but is important for this group. Forever is not a useful planning horizon. It renders all of the math meaningless. Divide anything by infinity, and your ROI looks pretty good. The other retention policies that we end up using, things like 10 years or 25 years, work well because they let us have functional math and do business modeling, but they beg some questions. What happens in year 11 or year 26? Sure, we're decent, well-intentioned people, but how do we trust one another and make meaningful assurances of those commitments? It's an important question for us. And one of the things that RECAP's done is to be able to put some teeth into this agreement by decoupling intent and operations. So RECAP exists as a New Jersey not-for-profit corporation, and Pache, Mr. Romney, corporations are not quite like people. They have an indefinite life. And the agreements we're making about retention apply to the corporation. So all of the shared print and retention agreements persist for the life of the corporation, and it decouples that retention agreement from any work process we might put in place to realize it. That means that we continue to do capital and operating using the best available means. So we can ask the good questions about capital and operations. Do they measurably compromise or advance our intent? Are they good cost and benefits? And we have plenty of data to support decision-making here. In fact, we run our facility on a 10-year major maintenance plan that we update every year so that we're always capitalizing the next round of replaced equipment and the like. That separation lets us have a freer hand in optimizing our work processes. Sometimes things break, they become chaotic. Sometimes we have to test things over and over again. And in fact, preservation is really the art of moving through those changes at a pretty controlled way and making sure that over time, complicated things become simple and that we continually move towards best practice. So with that, I'm going to thank you for your time and attention and give you the links promised. From the homepage of our website, recap.princeton.edu, you can see the Discovery to Delivery report. There's a short URL up there for those of you who are tweeting away. I want to thank again the Andrew Mellon Foundation who supported this work and remind you all that this is available under a Creative Commons license, so please do share and please do attribute. Finally, I've also posted a link there to a set of work that I did with Annie Peterson, who's at Tulane now. This was a lot to support the West project. Some modeling of these scarcity questions that we've been raising, sort of what's the optimal number of copies. You can find that at the jacobnadal.com/162. So with that, thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Lizanne.
Hi, good afternoon. I want to talk to you about what we're doing in Maine, which is certainly different than what you heard from Jake. So to try to give you some context, why print retention in Maine? Maine's a very collaborative state, and multi-type library collaboration is the norm. So we do lots of stuff with academics and publics and school and hospital libraries, all in the same group. This project originated with a larger libraries group, the 9 largest libraries in Maine, which hold 3/4 of the print collection in the state. Colby Basin Bowdoin do a lot of collaboration, rich history there. We have a union catalog with about 100 libraries in it, and a statewide delivery system that's delivering about 1.25 million items across the state a year. Why did we do this? Partner libraries were running out of space, though it should be noted when we wrote the grant in 2010, that was true. In 2012, Colby built a 500,000 volume storage facility. That was not on the map when we wrote the grant. That certainly changed the dynamics of some of the decisions that were made later on. We did get an $821,000 IMLS grant to help us do this, which was certainly, would not have been this place. The focus is really on monographs and journals, and I'm only going to talk about the monographs piece. The focus is intentional on retention and not weeding. This for me, so I raised that political question at the last session. This to me is a political issue. I didn't want to go to my faculty and say, we're talking about what we're going to get rid of in terms of the collection across the state. I wanted to talk about making decisions of what we were going to retain first. So that they had some sense that there was a guarantee of a rich collection in the state before we made those decisions. And we certainly wanted to be part of the national conversation. So the project partners up here, Colby Basin Bowdoin, all private institutions. The University of Maine and University of Southern Maine, public academic institutions. Bangor Public Library and Portland Public Library, the 2 largest public libraries in the state, and the Maine State Library. Those were the original grant people and partners. And also partway into the project, Colby absorbed the collection for Bangor Theological Seminary, which went out of business after 199 years in Maine. And we were able to absorb that because we had a storage facility. If that had happened 2 years earlier, that would have gone somewhere else. But so they got incorporated into the analysis and into our collection. There's your project team. There are 3 co-PIs. There's a Directors Council, Collection Development and Technical Services Committees that help with stuff. A National Advisory Board was Ann and Constance and Bob, who helped us a lot. And we do have a project manager who keeps us all on task. Project goals. We were going to create our own collection analysis system. We ended up not doing that. I guess the big things out of here for me that were really important is we wanted to develop a strategy to make retention decisions at scale. You cannot make decisions on a one-by-one point with monographs. There's too many. I was really interested in thinking about what does the presence of large-scale digital collections like Hothy do when you're thinking about decisions. And we really wanted to expose our retention decisions to the world. And as we speak, retention decisions are being loaded into WorldCat. You have a number for us at this point? Somewhere over 500,000 retention commitments for monographs from Maine are already in WorldCat. So, questions. We wanted to know which monographs were going to be kept long term. Equitable and common sense distribution. We're very much pragmatists in Maine. And can those monographs decisions be made in a way at scale that are going to make sense to the participating libraries? And you will see at the end, it doesn't make sense for us, whether it makes sense to everybody. We do have a governance and business model, probably similar to a lot of other organizations across the U.S., a 15-year commitment. We discussed 25. None of the directors were willing to say, we're going to saddle our predecessors for 25 years with this commitment. The MOU is signed at the highest level we could manage within our institution. So at Colby, it was signed by the Vice President for Academic Affairs. So it's an institutional commitment. It's not just a library commitment. Data sharing, starting points. we looked at all the things you would imagine, copies of a particular work, do they circulate, how many times do they circulate, what's the relationship with the overlap in main cat, subject strengths, HathiTrust, all those things were sort of played into the model. An important thing for us is we did an OCLC reclamation right at the beginning of the process. That cleared up about 250,000 mistakes in the data, made the data really clean. That was really important. Another thing that was different for us that was probably from any of the other projects going around, or most of the other projects, we all had the same ILS. We all had the same ILS at approximately the same time in history. And so that made, things were counted in the same. So circulation in my system means the same as the circulation in Bates and the same as the circulation in the University of Maine. We all had about 23 years of circulation data, which was really, really helpful. We used sustainable collection services to do the analysis. Not at all surprising, they did some additional cleanup and normalization of data. Match titles on our OCLC number, that was our match point. We did compare our holdings against WorldCat, both US and the state of Maine, HathiTrust public domain, and in copyright, as well as the Internet Archive. They gave us extensive data reports and lots of consulting support, which was really helpful. They sort of, using their experience, helped us work through some of the scenarios of what things meant, which really helped. So high-level view of the data, 2.9 million bibliographic records from those 6 systems. Ended up with 1.75 million unique titles. By titles, we mean 2 different things. So they can mean a title set, which means if all 9 partners had a copy, that's the title set. The title holding is what belongs to one individual library, though that could mean more than 1 copy. So in this case, the title set from Maine State Library, they may have 6 copies of that, but it's still 1 title set. One of the things that we discovered, which surprised us and maybe shouldn't have, and I think we certainly saw it with the work that Constance and Brian did, was a lot of unique materials. We didn't expect that. So about 60% of the Maine collections were held by only 1 or 2 libraries. Maine is an old state. Bowdoin's the oldest institution in Maine, 1796. Colby Bates and Bowdoin are very similar institutions, similar curriculum. We expected the overlap to be much higher, but it wasn't. Only 99 titles held by all 9 libraries. And we looked at circulation counts, and as you can imagine, there's a high percentage that never circulated at all. So we're talking 23 years of data, never circulated. 1 minute left? 1 minute left. Okay, sorry. Well, I'm going to. So to sort of recap what we've done here, stuff that was by 1 or 2 libraries, we basically kept almost all of it, except if it had no circulations at all. We made no commitments to those. Figured after 23 years, isn't really that important. Local interest rules, we kept all kinds of local stuff. We'll get back to, in the 2 or more, 3 or more, category, again, lots of stuff. There were about 750,000 titles in scope, and those were the ones where we made a sort of a complicated procedure. I think we'll go here. So things that circulated between 0 and 3 times, we kept 1 copy. Things that were more than 4, we kept 2 copies. Kept obviously the local protected ones, but I think what's important here is how things were allocated. And this is where the Colby Storage Facility came into play. If Colby holds a title, Colby kept it, because we had more space than any other library in Maine. Circulation rules also play into effect in if Bates or Bowdoin had a copy. Colby, Bates, and Bowdoin have year-long loan rules for faculty. We were not willing to give up our year-long loan rule for the University of Maine copy where you could borrow it for 28 days. So that was really important to us to say, we're going to keep the longer loaning period. And then the rest of the stuff was sort of divided equally amongst the other partners. So sort of the last slide, since my time is up, this is how things sort of played out in terms of of what we decided, and it turned out actually to be pretty equitable across the groups, in spite of the fact that in a certain category, Colby ended up keeping a lion's share of the more current materials. But because of that really high uniqueness, in 60% of the material owned by one or two libraries, that really sort of helped distribute things. So I'll stop there, and we can go on to Pamela, and we can ask other questions later.
This is the context for the formation of MI-SPI, the Michigan Shared Print Initiative. We were, the people involved in this initiative are state-supported institutions that have a very long history of being very independent, yet we also have a long history of collaborating on group purchases and some other collection-related kinds of projects through the Midwest Collaborative of Libraries for Library Services, MCLS. That's what rolls off the tongue much easier. MCLS is our consortium. And the people involved, the institutions involved, have been very active in working on projects with MCLS. So here's the context for the beginning of MI-SPI. There were a couple of interested parties that had a very urgent need for making some space. One particular institution was having to absorb a couple of branch collections. Another institution was needing to open up some space for study and student group work, as well as having to incorporate some branch collections. They were closing down several branches on campus. And one particular institution had been doing some hefty weeding previous to this in preparation for their brand new building, which was going to have quite a modified space, I think you would say, for collections, physical collections. One of the institutions, mine, was very interested in collection assessment data, and this was going to provide us with a situation where we could compare and modify our collections and shape going forward. It would also provide us with some information for program review, which was happening on a regular basis throughout campus. And we were also looking at, with a new collection development person in place, reallocating the budget for acquisitions. So with this interested group in place and these couple of urgent needs, we came together to have a conversation. And we agreed on some long-term goals for this project. Reducing the physical collection footprint was something we could all see, maybe not immediately, but in the near future, needing to repurpose space, improving study space, promoting the library as place more than warehouse, helping identify the potential titles that we might want to digitize and use to support a membership in the Hathi Trust, and continuing to build on collective collections. That is, as Clem said, kind of joining the party. Here are the participants. You'll see, rather than my doing this and the usual Michigan map kind of thing, I asked our graphic artist to put this up on the slide. The names that you see in black are the current participants, and the names that are in blue are those that are waiting in the wings. We intend to expand our collective collection in the very near future, that is within a year, year and a half, adding these 4 more into the collection. We worked with SCS. Each of the 7 pilot project initial participants contributed an equal amount of money to the pool. We hired SCS to come in and work with us. They took all of our circulating data as well as those bibliographic records, and that is one thing that we pared down as we did things. We ended up working with a collective collection of circulating material. So special collections and material that was reference-oriented, that never circulated, that was very early on removed from all of the manipulations and analysis. What we agreed upon as a group was this withdrawal criteria. 3 or fewer circulations since 1999, prior to 2005, or added to the collection before 2005. And we are retaining 2 copies. We decided that 2 copies was comfortable among the 7. So one of the criteria was that we would be dealing with withdrawal items that were held by more than 2. Here's a very tiny chart that shows you the number of retention items in the end that were committed to by each institution, and the number of withdrawal candidates that we could, each of us, take out of our collections and still maintain the 2 copies among the group. You'll notice that Wayne State, the second to the bottom there, has a very, very large withdrawal count. They ended up withdrawing significantly more than this, but a lot of that was multiple copy kinds of things because they were condensing the branch collections in. And you'll notice that CMU has a very hefty retention count. That was because we have a relatively new building. It's about a 10-year-old building when all of this was taking place. And our circulating collection is entirely on compact shelving. So we really didn't have a space problem. We weren't looking to make space at this point in time. So we were able to do some what our executive director likes to call horse trading. We were able to say, we'll give up some of our withdrawal count to help these couple of libraries that needed to reach a certain goal, and we will take on a larger retention count. Eastern Michigan, EMU, the second in line there, also did some of that horse trading. The status of deselection for the 7, it's a relatively small percent of what could have been withdrawn. About out of the 535,000 titles that could be withdrawn, about 36% has been removed at this point. And as I mentioned, the largest project was Wayne State. They took out over 190 items. And here's a picture of their before as they were weeding things out, emptying shelves in this one particular area. They did this in multiple places. This is the new space that they've been able to repurpose and open up that lovely window space. They now have lots of light and a nice view, and as I've been told, this space is quite popular. As we worked our way through this retention consequences, CMU came up with a number of questions that I brought to some succeeding meetings for MI-SPI. We have a couple of annual processes that we go through, and I'm sure most of you have similar kinds of collection maintenance processes, a lost and missing process, and our mending and repair process that works through our Circulation Access Services Department, makes its way up into technical services. Collection librarians review these materials, review lists of lost and missing things, they make decisions, and those decisions come to tech services for the database to be corrected and for things to be withdrawn, physically taken out. As we were working through some of these things, we very quickly came upon items that had a 583, a note to retain. Out of our 204,000 retention items, we quickly came across a number of things that we had committed to keep on behalf of the other 6. So those kinds of questions, what do we do about this? This is an item that is clearly not going to be on our shelves. It's lost, or it's in such terrible condition, we're not going to put it back on the shelf. Do we replace these? Are we responsible? Are we obligated to replace these things? Or do we say our copy is gone and make a notification to the rest of the 6 that the one copy is the archival copy? Up to this point, we've been dealing with what Rick Lugg likes to refer to as service copies. All of these retention items are still in the circulating collection, and they can come and go. We do have the retention holdings note, and all of those notes are in the local catalogs. We have not yet migrated this information into the statewide union catalog, MELCAT, and we haven't migrated that information, uploaded it into OCLC, WorldCat yet. There is a database located at MCLS that we all have access to, and part of our conversation about these items that are lost and missing and can't be repaired, part of the conversation has been, how do we put notification into this database and make it an interactive MI-SPI shared information database? Our future is under discussion. We will be having a meeting in a couple of weeks. We plan to add new members, but we need to plan when to do that. When is it going to be most convenient for the new members as well as the current folks involved in the project? And at the time of that refresh, we're going to be redistributing those retention decisions. So that 204,000 that CMU has and the 170-some thousand that a couple other partners have is going to get redistributed, and we hope kind of lowered. And we'll be broadening the horizon. What else is there for us to be involved with? Serials, print serials, retention is one of the items on the agenda. So that is where MI-SPI is. Okay. Welcome.
So at this point, we'd like to open it up to any of your questions. I have some questions if people aren't ready from the floor, but we would prioritize floor questions first. Yeah, here comes a question.
Would the group comment at all about the sustainability of in a hybrid situation of paper and screen delivery, the sustainability of the interplay, the interdependence, the intersection of the two stored formats and those that may emerge. I'm thinking superficially, just, foldouts in Hati Trust, which we've had to supply, and some of the other little anomalies. But I'm thinking, is there a sustainability issue here in the longer reach?
I'm happy to jump in and say a little about that. I think that there, are questions always about funding and the like, but I don't think that these things are in conflict, and I think in some ways they act as stakeholders for one another. I think if you kind of harken back to the beginning of the afternoon when we looked at what was in and out of copyright alone, the small amount of material pre-1950 or certainly pre-23 means that for any useful kind of planning purposes, unless you think that all of the orphan works and Google Book settlements will be wrapped up in the next year or two or three, we have to keep a print copy, right? That's where our property rights and our intellectual property opportunities come from. And so having a print network to maintain those is important. I think I would just also commend to our attention the work that MLA has done in 1995, their original statement on the use of the primary source artifact, and that's work that they're revisiting now, again, to sort of reissue their guidance as sort of one of our major humanities scholarly societies about what they think books are used for and what they think printed matter is used for. And what I think we see in practice and in what people say about our collections is that there are sets of exclusive uses, things you can only do with digital content and only can do with the original physical manifestation, and there are areas of overlap. So Gary, I think that it's a smart question, and I think it points to the question of how many print copies do we need to maintain. But I think in actuality that digital and print actually have a lot of dependencies on one another.
Okay, I think it's on, yes, okay. I think your point about there are lots of interdependencies, and I don't think we can be exclusive about it's all going to be digital or we have to save every single bit of print that we have. It's like collection development policies. You have to shape them for the people you're serving. What is the collective population? What are those various academic programs that we need to serve? What are the students studying? What are they using? That's an issue that my institution is really focusing on right now. What is it that the students need, and what are they using, and how are they getting to it? Yes, there will always be a need for some print things, but as Jake said, how many copies do you really need if they're within 24 hours of delivery to you? So it depends.
And I think it's been interesting the extent to which a corresponding copy in Hati Trust was not a selection driver for some of these. In the recap case, and this is before Jacob's time, so he's forgiven for not remembering these conversations, but Constance and I were involved in that planning project, and there was some discussion of shall recap prioritize the holdings that match recap holdings, and an explicit decision was made not to do so, but rather to say the selection for the recap shared collection will be the presence now in the recap shared facility and the transfer in the future to the recap facility. I know the more customized and sophisticated sort of multivariable collection analysis projects like Maine and MI-SPI have brought that more into consideration, and maybe Clem and Pamela can talk a little bit about the extent to which priority was given to Hati or Internet Archive or other kinds of digital surrogates.
In Maine, we ran the analysis of our collections against Hathi. The overlap is really, really small, much smaller than I was anticipating. I think around 113,000 titles from the Maine collection matched Hathi Trust public domain. So in terms of, substituting Hathi for those 113, there was not a lot to be gained. Sort of also thinking of that interplay between physical and digital, it really depends on who's using the material and at what time. Right now we have a history professor who's teaching a course on the history of Colby and really wants students to use physical materials. But a number of the physical things that she wants them to use are actually digitized and in Hathi Trust. And I can imagine at 2 in the morning, those students who are doing the assignment they're not going to wait till Special Collections is open at 9 o'clock the next morning. They're going to call up the Hathi Trust copy and they're going to make use of that. So some of it really depends on time of day, practice. The fact that the convenience of digital, even where a faculty member says you really need to use the print. I mean, in the long run, for some of those things, it's going to be really hard for the faculty member to say to tell the student that, well, I can tell that you didn't use the print copy versus the digital copy. For us, in terms of our analysis, we decided that we were not going to make long-term commitments to stuff that was in Hathi Trust, but that was predominantly because those copies also showed no circulation over 23 years. And we figured that the fact that they existed in Hathi and we had physical copies that nobody wanted, that those were really not an issue for us.
We didn't give much weight to Hathi. It was an interesting statistic in all of those tables that SCS provided to us, but we didn't base any criteria really. We didn't talk very long about overlap with Hathi. Maybe a little bit more emphasis on how many libraries, how many holdings were there in WorldCat, but we were pretty focused on what we held among ourselves and what we were going to hold for each other. And I think I neglected to say that we have a commitment for 15 years to work together and hold these materials as a collective. So that wasn't a big factor, those two things.
Sarah Pritchard from Northwestern. I wondered if I could just follow up on what Pamela was just saying. You had a slide where you indicated that of the things that were identified for overlap, only 36% were selected. I don't remember whether that was just one particular library's holdings or collectively. Can you give examples of what were some of the reasons? To me, that seemed like a small percentage. So why were people then not sending? I mean, these have already been identified as good candidates. Were these an eclectic array of local decisions, or could you generalize about why people didn't send the other?
And let me clarify that we aren't sending anywhere. We are holding, those retained copies are held in our 7 libraries. There is no centralized storage facility. This is distributed shared print among the 7, soon to be 9 or 10. Yes, that is a very small number, and that is for the collective. That there was an opportunity to withdraw 530-some thousand items from our collections and still retain 2 copies among the 7. That Wayne State did the largest, as I mentioned, and one of the smaller state schools, Saginaw Valley, did a significant amount of withdrawal in order to incorporate a branch collection. Central did a very, very focused withdrawal in the STM portions of the collection. And I think we withdrew about 600 titles. Eastern Michigan had a very serious flood in their underground storage facility, their robotics storage facility, and they literally closed off that whole portion of the collection. So they didn't withdraw anything because a mold mildew problem began. So their deselection program has just been put way back until they can get that all under control. Other places did small amounts. Grand Valley did about 6,000, as I recall, and the others are doing very slow. There was the urgency among those couple, and they've taken care of that space difficulty. Now the rest of us are following slowly.
So that sort of supports the focus that Clem mentioned for Maine, where the goal was not so much explicitly space reclamation, although it was for certain specific libraries, but more to get in place a plan for retention and stewardship.
So I have a question that's prompted by the lost and dilapidated books at CMU. The first question that anyone asks about a shared print agreement is, how do I know you're going to keep it? And we've got lots of ways of answering that question. The second question is, how do I know it's in good enough shape to be worth keeping? And so the specter that haunts at least the popular mind when it comes to shared print is, oh yeah, you've agreed to keep it, but they're all highlighted and marked and they're in bad shape. So Constance reminded us that in any given smallish consortium, or CIC, a largish one, that there are going to be enough other copies elsewhere in the country, so if yours goes missing or dilapidated, it'll still be around. So one of the advantages perhaps of all of these smaller projects rather than a national one is that we do have a lot more insurance and wiggle room. But every project says we can't afford to assess the condition of the things we're retaining. So I'd like the panelists and others in the room to imagine what kind of process might we use and what it would be worth. I mean, we could say, right scaling this says it's not worth it, but I'd really like to see some research on this matter of what it would take. Second, apropos of the Modern Language Association's work, the American Council of Learned Societies, the AHA, ARL, and a few other organizations are participating in that. And one of the major concerns of the group is going to be, how do we talk about right sizing, right scaling, retention decisions when in fact any individual copy retained cannot represent, whether it's digitized or retained in print, cannot represent the multiple values that multiple copies might have. So there will certainly be people in our association who say, you've got to save everything, which is basically the recommendation of the 1995 document. And there will be current friends of a looser approach who will say we want to make sure we are preserving those copies that have artifactual value. So 2 questions in one.
Well, I'll speak to the inventory and validation piece. I just don't think that there's personally any way or any value in doing large-scale either inventory or validation. I think the easier way would be just to sort of up the number of copies that you keep, and then when you encounter a particular copy, either because it circulates or for some other reason, you then make decisions on that. I mean, in Maine, we're a relatively small project. 2.9 million bibliographic records. I can't imagine even paying student workers to even think about verifying that the stuff actually existed on the shelf, let alone was the stuff on the shelf in good condition. I certainly don't want to go to my administration and ask for that kind of money to do that. I would rather say, let's say, oh, we're going to keep 3 extra copies in Maine. That's an easier sell, and then at some point, as you encounter those copies, you deal with them.
I'm thinking that as we expand the project and we come to our critical mass within Michigan, that the 2 copies within the state is going to be still, I think, remembering that these are items of a certain age that haven't gone out since 1999, and when they have, it's been 0, 1, 2, possibly 3 times in that span of time. These are not high demand items. I've lost my train of thought. Why don't you go ahead,
All
Jay?
right. Well, yeah. I'll jump in and to a certain extent second. What's been said. Obviously, we're talking about 49.8 million items. We're not going to have the labor force to look at each and every one of them and do cross comparison. But we do actually have a lot of very good data about this question. So we know from JSTOR's validation efforts some rates of problems in serials. We know from preservation surveys that have been done some sort of prevailing rates of damage that we see in stacks conditions. And I think what those data tell us is that, yes, problems occur, but that we're dealing with a problem, not a crisis, right? So sure, things are marked up, sure, things are damaged, but that these are usually single-digit percentages, and that any actual practical difference we can attain is also a sort of single-digit percentage. So Don Aveline, who's the preservation officer at UCLA, and I looked at this comparing just the UCLA campus copies to the storage repository copies for significant signs of difference in condition. And there were differences, but we weren't dealing with a perfect collection and an imperfect collection. We were dealing with 2 imperfect collections. And so that I think this is an area where we have to be very conscious about looking for what the delta is between the prevailing options, not a sort of imagined perfect world that we don't actually have access to, and our actual well-used collections. I guess I would also just sort of say that I think Clem's correct that we have to also look for points where in the life cycle of materials where preservation, inspection, and intervention kind of add value to rather than create a new process. So if something's sitting at 50 degrees and 35% relative humidity in the dark, we know it's not changing. And so the question really is, as it circulates or as the option comes to replace it, is it worthwhile? And I think when we look at this as in a sort of managed kind of data-driven framework, actually a lot of these decisions become a lot more practical. We can put better value to them.
Also, one of the things that the recap planning report proposes is a concept called minimum acceptable condition, I think it's called. And the idea was to say you identify certain filtering criteria. If the book is not in the minimally acceptable condition, it can't be considered part of the retained shared collection. And this didn't mean go and proactively review all the items in advance, but when they came through, when they were retrieved or refiled, then look at them and say, if now looking at it in hand, we can see it doesn't meet that minimum condition, then take it out in terms of metadata from the shared collection. And it was a question of how it's recorded in the metadata, and the minimum acceptable condition did not have to be specifically recorded. We left open the possibility that in the future some additional levels of gradation could be defined that would need to be recorded, but the thinking at this point was it was too costly to build that into the process for every book and to retrospectively review every book.
I had a question about operationalizing selection decisions as a kind of life cycle issue for shared collection. So in two of the cases we heard about, SCS provided some support for selecting, defining, helping to understand the consortium to what kind of material might be in scope for a shared collection. I'm wondering over time how you continue to groom and grow that shared collection, understanding that the context in which that situation exists is changing all the time. So even if you limit it, even if you exclude condition, there are changes in the wider community. Holdings will drop off, other holdings will be added. Similarly, there are moving wall kinds of issues with respect to, say, in MI-SPI, growth of the partnership, right? So the end just changed. What happens then? How do you plan for the future to continue to either adjust the thresholds that originally applied or ensure that they're carried forward beyond the term of let's build our first shared collection?
In Maine, we certainly have an intent to sort of review things on a sort of a 5-year basis. So I think that's amongst the original partners. I think that certainly makes sense. And talking about how we would sort of move our moving wall, because we mainly looked at material published before 2003. So obviously, long term, we're going to have to adjust that. As we've talked about bringing other partners on within Maine, there is no sense that we would redistribute the retention commitments. One of the things that we've tried to do, even though we made a set of retention commitments, we've not prohibited individual libraries for making additional retention commitments for stuff that they did not commit, that was not allocated. So for an example, Bowdoin has a very large Arctic Studies program. Some of those Arctic Studies things probably got picked up as retention commitments for them. Some of them didn't. And my suspicion is somewhere along the line, they're going to sort of gather all that stuff up and say, this is important to us, and we're going to add 583s for those things, even though they're not they didn't sort of come together as part of this project. And I think that's important, and I think that's one of the things that I really wanted to see happen in this is say, here's sort of the basic landscape. This is statewide what we're going to commit to, and then let individual libraries think about the curricular and program needs of their institution and say, these are things that are important to us, we're going to keep these. These are things that we don't care about, we're either going to get rid of them or we're going to do some of the horse trading. And in this case, not a horse trading of commitments, maybe actually a horse trading of physical collections. You're teaching this, we no longer teach this. Can we give you these 2,000 books because rather than you borrowing them from us all the time, you keep them. So I think there's going to be some of that going on as people get past this sort of original commitment stage and think how you operationalize it.
Cleb, could you say a little bit about how you envision it working operationally? I mean, say it's 5 years from now. Would all the original participants provide their data all anew? I know you're probably not even to that point, but that's one of the considerations is how do you sort of do it all again with a new set of participants in the future?
I don't think we would redo all of the data. I think we would look at the stuff published since 2003, as well as any stuff from new participants and looking for things for which there are not already commitments made. Now, the thing that I don't know of course, all of this is sort of crystal ball gazing to some extent. But because of the emergence of the sort of this shared print initiative that's beginning to take somewhat shape in the East, Eastern Academic Scholars Trust, which has a whole variety of participants, it's really hard to say what changes that project might make, and what changes it might happen if we get some of the other large public libraries within the state of Maine to participate. We're not, all the rest of the academic libraries in Maine are very small. We're talking, with collections under 50,000 volumes. They're unlikely to have a huge impact on what we do. But there are a couple of, 3 or 4 medium-sized, I guess, public libraries that would have collections of around 200,000 volumes, which might make a difference in what's in the analysis.
I guess I also just want to say that I think another way to frame the question is, when would you opt out of a shared print environment? And to be maybe a little, to push that a little bit, when would you opt out of being an interlibrary loan participant? And I think it's a similar sort of question. That is, if we buy a book for our library, we don't at that time explicitly decide, yes, I will answer ILL requests on this, or no, I will not, and unless it's something that's going into a particular special collection. And I think likewise, we, in practice, have always treated our collections as shared print resources. That is, we've relied on one another and backstopped one another by having a large national network of libraries, many of whom keep their collections for a long time. I think what we're seeing now is an inflection point where we're going from a sort of in-principle commitment to making it explicit. And I think it's important that we don't sort of overanalyze or sort of overburden that process. That in fact, we in many cases, I think we're seeing that we just assume that things will be part of the shared collection unless we have a very deliberate reason not to make them so.
For MI-SPI, we were talking about the next phase from the very beginning. We knew that there was this original 7 that were ready to go, but we also knew that at least 2 of those waiting in the wings institutions, it wasn't exactly the best time for them. It wasn't the right time for them, and they, since we've gotten organized, they're ready to join in. So even as we were setting up the original criteria and going through all the analysis and the discussions, there was always a conversation about the refresh. When we add the new members and the refresh happens, etc. So we sort of were planning that second phase, that second step right from the start. How we expand this very focused thing is what we want to talk about now. This is shared monographs on a relatively small scale, the state of Michigan. What else can we do in the state of Michigan in our academic libraries that's going to create more open space, repurposing of space, and yet enhance the sharing of the collections that we have all invested in? So that answers that.
Hi, I'm Rob Karras from Star Campus of Kent State University. I know I'm supposed to ask a question, but I was actually going to answer your question. Because you asked, when do libraries buy things knowing whether or not they're going to share them? And I know it's not part of this discussion today, but I think it's worth thinking about. I think most libraries in this room are doing that very thing right now when they buy electronic books. Because they're buying things they know they're not going to be able to share by contract with the vendors. And we're seeing a lot more of that. So I don't really have a question, but it poses
It's a really interesting point, though, to be a little lawyerly about it. You didn't buy an electronic book. You licensed the usage of it. And I think that's a really important distinction for us to keep in mind, especially regarding the question of sort of why do you keep print in an electronic world, is because they're very different kind of atomic structures, but they're also very different legal structures. But yeah, it's a very good point. And the interplay of sort of print collections and their relationship to e-licensing decisions that groups make. We alluded to this when you talked earlier about the CIC's shared journal project. I mean, to the extent that a print archive facilitates electronic licensing with a safety net, I think it's a really interesting project.
I think the other dimension to this, though, is we're having a discussion about how we can right scale, upscale, enhance the sharing of print. And I wonder, the whole idea of electronic books and the inability to share says to me, I wonder if we can do that. I wonder if the library community is ready to address anything at that scale, when at the same time we're kind of fighting against their own interests. Anyway, I'll shut up.
A somewhat different question. We had talked about, or we wanted to get into talking about, rather, the sort of how selection and sustainability interact. And with these, especially with these highly customized collection analysis projects, where the selection of the materials that are destined for the program are determined through a very detailed collection analysis, it also pretty much identifies who the collection holders will be. That's sort of an innate part of the process. So then how do you reflect in your business model what kind of role those collection holders play? Do they get any compensation for that? And that's of course a generic question that affects all shared print programs. You know, do the collection holders get compensation? But it sort of ties back directly to how are things selected for the kinds of programs that are based on collection analysis. And I wondered if maybe Clem and Pamela could talk about the business model and how it relates to the collection holders, if it does.
In Maine, things tend to be done very collaboratively and to some extent on a handshake. This project grew out of the larger libraries group, which has been around for 100 years. So there's a sort of 100 years of collaboration. And certainly a large degree of trust amongst the players. So even though while we do have a formal MOU, I think, and as you can, you know, what people are keeping is very different, and it's not. And while it's moderately equally distributed, there certainly are some variations, and collectively everybody's fine with that. Now that certainly may not be the case in other places. It's just sort of part of the structure of how things work in Maine. Things are done very collaboratively. People contribute money and time for lots of statewide projects without formal agreements, because of the I guess because we're good citizens type thing. I mean, it's that sort of collaborative model, and because Maine is a relatively poor state economically, people really have been very willing to sort of pitch in and do almost anything to make things work. And I can't imagine the economy of Maine. I mean, it's been economically depressed for 30 years. I can't imagine it's going to turn around and make radical changes that would sort of upset that balance anytime soon. So I think the business model for that sort of business model works for us. It wouldn't necessarily work in other types of institutions.
We have some infrastructure already in place. When we began talking about MI-SPI, all of the members are participants in MelCat, the Michigan Electronic Library Shared Catalog. We are all resource sharing partners through that, and we all share in the state delivery costs, as do all other members of MelCat. So we had that kind of underlying support already in place. If we were going to decide to do this shared distributed archiving of these service copies, we could easily request those things and share them among ourselves very easily and very efficiently. So to the extent that kind of that part of the business model existed already, we could build on top of that. We don't really have one otherwise. We're sharing and collaborating. The initial cost of paying for the analysis was an equal amount of money that was charged to each of the 7, and that pool paid for those costs, and it has been dispensed. Where some of the conversation about reimbursement, or is it really my institution's responsibility to make sure that there is a viable copy of this item on behalf of the other 7, that's where some business model conversation has started. Do we need to put in some sort of an annual replacement contribution that MCLS will monitor for us? And when we order replacement copies, do we somehow get some of that back? It hasn't gotten to any level where it's been really a penalty to anybody. So possibly with the expansion, that shared responsibility may be even less. So we're just waiting to see.
Are there any more questions from the floor or the remote viewers? Or is it low blood sugar time?
I want to make one more comment. It was an answer to Bob's question. Second question was, I don't think really ever got answered. The idea of can one copy substitute for another? And I think one of and this is a place where I think OCLC needs to play a leading role. The metadata you find in WorldCat does not tell me that the copy at Colby is different than the copy at Occidental, or different than the copy at Recap. You know, if the Recap copy is signed by the author, I can't tell from WorldCat that that's the case. I can't tell if there's marginalia. I can't tell any of those things that scholars say that are really important, that where your copy isn't the same as my copy. And WorldCat needs to step up to the plate on this one and provide some infrastructure so that we can actually determine that, because that will help in making some of those decisions that will allow people to say, oh, my copy is just a generic copy, and here are 6 copies that have very important differences that are difference to scholars. And you can't tell that now from WorldCat. All I can tell is that I have a copy and Bob has a copy and Jake has a copy, and yeah, they may be the same and they may not be the same at all.
And I'll speak up for OCLC, which I sometimes do and sometimes don't do, to say there are metadata structures to support that data if the libraries would provide them. What we all need to do as a community is facilitate the providing of that data and encourage OCLC very strongly to make those processes scalable, so that the data can and will be provided and maintained by the libraries. It's always the metadata.